So the first step in the process for loaf number 1 is to make the leaven. This is actually one of the trickier parts of the tartine recipe with respect to time and temperature, because the recipe specifically calls for an overnight leaven build at a cool temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 18.3 degrees Celsius. That's difficult to replicate year-round in most people's kitchens. So you have to approximate, based on your overnight kitchen temperature, that if it were 65 degrees or 18 degrees Celsius, and that might take 12 hours, you have to try to guess at higher temperatures how long it would take. So I'm heading into fall here in Cleveland. It's mid-October, so we're right on the cusp of getting into some cooler nights where I could replicate that 65 degree Fahrenheit temperature. But last night I miscalculated the overnight temperature, so I thought it was going to be in the low 70s, which would be the low 20s Celsius. So I only planned for the leaven to go for about 6 hours, which is usually what it takes if my temperature is about 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius. It turns out that the overnight temperature dropped into the 60s and my kitchen got very cool last night. So consequently, my leaven is not ready. And this is an unplanned aspect of managing time and temperature. You're seeing it right here, is you can't control your overnight temperature. So now all I can do is wait for time. So I have to give this a little bit more time. The way that I can tell if the leaven is ready, number one is I always smell it. And over time, you'll develop a sense of what this should smell like. When it still smells like a bag of flour, when that raw flour smell is evident, it's really not ready. You'll see it start to rise. It only calls for about a 20% rise, so you really can't rely on the rise. You'll see some bubbles forming around the edges, and you'll really just smell the change, and you'll see a little bit of a change in the consistency. It starts to get a little bit more liquefied and a little bit more aerated. The tartine recipe also famously calls for the float test, where we'll take a spoonful of the leaven, put it in water, and see if it floats. A lot of people argue that test is unreliable. I agree that test is unreliable, but specifically for this recipe, if you make the leaven following the exact recipe using the mix of flour and water that they recommend and using this overnight cold build, the float test usually is reliable in this recipe. So I'll do the float test and we'll see if it works here, but the leaven's not ready. So I have two options here. I can just give it more time, which I'm planning to do. The other option is I could try to increase the temperature. This is a big mistake because I did this once before. I was doing one of these videos, the leaven wasn't ready in the morning. I was on a production schedule, my film crew was here. I don't actually have a film crew, I'm the film crew, but I wanted to stick to my schedule. So I said, oh, I can just heat this up and get the leaven to move along. So I turned on the light in my oven. It was in the summer. My temperature in the oven got up to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. I put my leaven into the oven. It certainly heated up very quickly, but you know what happens when your leaven reaches that temperature of about 90 degrees Fahrenheit? It releases the unwanted house guest. The protease enzyme emerged. My leaven got very liquefied, got very acidic, and that protease enzyme became very prominent. I added that to my dough, and 3 hours later, I didn't even make it through bulk fermentation. My dough was completely overproofed and unusable. So we don't want to get impatient and try to heat this up. I'm just going to leave this on my countertop, which right now is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius, and just give it more time. Okay, we are ready to mix up loaf number 1. Now this loaf we want to bulk ferment at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 24 degrees Celsius. That's roughly my room temperature right now. I'm sitting right at about 75. My leaven took a long time to develop. As I said, I started this last night and my room temperature dropped into the low 60s Fahrenheit, which is about 17 degrees Celsius. So the leaven really did not do much until this morning when it warmed up here. So this has actually gone for approximately 10 hours, which is a long time. I mean, typically when I make this in the winter, it'll go overnight for 12 hours, but it got off to such a slow start. It's just bubbling. It's increased in volume by about 40%, which is a little bit more than what the recipe calls for. And then the tartine recipe recommends doing the float test, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So let's give the float test a try. So when you do the float test, you want to make sure you scoop out enough of the leaven to give it some buoyancy. Sometimes people just use a small drop and it'll sink to the bottom. So I like to take a spoonful if I can, and that's floating. So we passed the float test, so this is good to go. Again, the float test is a useful but not 100% certain test. When it floats, it usually means it's ready, but there are times when it doesn't float and the leaven is perfectly fine to use as well. So it's what's called a sufficient but not required test. So now we're going to mix up the dough and I'll do the desired dough temperature calculation, and I'll go through the details here this time to show how this works. So as I mentioned, the standard desired dough temperature calculator uses room temperature and the flour temperature and the starter temperature to come up with the desired water temperature. I don't like that formula, so I created my own. So I'm going to use a gram weighted calculation. So to do the desired dough temperature calculation, let me do the example here. So I'm going to take the temperature of my flour. This is sitting at 73 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 22.8 degrees Celsius. I'm going to take the temperature of my starter, which is sitting at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25 degrees Celsius. I had this sitting up on top of my refrigerator, so it's a little bit warmer than my room temperature. And then what we want to calculate is the temperature of the water that'll bring all these together at 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius. These are all roughly in the ballpark, so this is a pretty simplistic calculation. When we move into the future loaves where we're really moving the temperature a lot, you'll see how this works a little bit differently. But basically, I'm going to use 250 grams of flour. So I take that 73 degrees Fahrenheit times 250 grams of flour. That gives me what I call these temperature units, is the temperature times the weight. I'm going to use 50 grams of leaven at 77 degrees Fahrenheit. I multiply those two together. I know that I need 175 grams of water, so I can back into what the water temperature should be to average all these out to be the 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius that I want to use. So let me punch this into my trusty supercomputer, and then I'll get my results here. So let me just go through this calculation. 250 grams of flour at 73 degrees Fahrenheit is 18,250 temperature units. I'm going to do this in Fahrenheit. Plus my starter 77 degrees Fahrenheit at 50 grams gives me 3,850 temperature units. The sum of those two is 22,100. I know that I have 175 grams of water coming, which will give me a total of all the ingredients of 475 grams. I know that total has to be 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so my total temperature units needs to be 35,625. The difference of temperature units that I need to add from the water is 13,525, which means if I have 175 grams of that, my calculated water temperature needs to be 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the way the math works, and I just do this gram weighted where I multiply the temperature times the gram. It's a very simplistic approach. As I mentioned, to be more accurate with this, the flour and the starter have a different density than the water, so you can do a density adjusted version of this formula, which would give me 76 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to be somewhere between 77 and 76. And then using the desired dough temperature calculator from the Jeffrey Hamelman book or the King Arthur website, as I mentioned, the 3-factor method would have given me a desired dough temperature of 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the exact same as my gram weighted calculation. And the 4-factor method, which was what we should be using if we're including the starter or the leaven, would give me a desired water temperature of 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which I'm pretty sure would undershoot the target here. So that's why I don't like that desired dough temperature calculation, because I can already tell just looking at it, if I had used that, I don't believe that it would give me a warm enough temperature to end up at 75. Here are the details of the water temperature calculation in Fahrenheit and Celsius using all 4 of the methods You can pause the video here if you're interested in looking at this in more detail. So I'm going to use my simple gram weighted calculation of 77 degree Fahrenheit water, 25 degrees Celsius, because I have the option of using 75 degrees, 76 degrees, 77 degrees, using those different calculations. When you're working with the water temperature, I recommend that you should try to overshoot your target a little bit, because it's a lot easier to reduce the dough temperature than it is to raise the dough temperature after all the ingredients are mixed. Just by exposing the dough to room temperature air, it will drop down to the room temperature of 75 just by turning, flipping, aerating the dough. If I came in at 74 degrees Fahrenheit and I need to get it up to 75, it's very difficult to do that once all the ingredients are added. The only way I can do that is in my proofing chamber. I'd have to put that in the oven with the light on, and it takes a really long time to get that dough back up, even 1 degree Fahrenheit. So I always tend to overshoot these water temperatures a little bit, gives me a little bit of wiggle room, and I'll demonstrate that here. So I have my 175 grams of water. This is currently sitting at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I need to get this up to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25 degrees Celsius. So as you're doing these water temperature adjustments, I do this in my microwave, and it gets really frustrating at times because you put it in for 15 seconds, it gets too hot. You cool it down, it gets too cool. You heat it back up, it gets too hot. And it's a lot of trial and error. So what I did over time is I created this water temperature chart. You could create one of these just someday when you're sitting around for your 30-minute breaks between stretch and folds. Just do some experiments with different quantities of water at different times in your microwave. So I'll put this on the screen, and what you can see is this gives me examples of water quantities and time in the microwave. So for example, I have 175 grams of water here. I only need to get it up to 77 degrees. So I look at my 200 gram line. Even for 15 seconds, I'd be at 97 degrees. So I'd overshoot the target. So I'm going to put this in for about 10 seconds. It just gives me a ballpark number to try to get it right on the first try. So I just heated this up for 10 seconds in the microwave. Let's see where it is. Now this is a common mistake that people make, is you take your water out of the microwave, you put your thermometer in it. This says 76 degrees, but you really need to stir this because the outside edge is 77 degrees. This corner is 80 degrees. This one's 81 degrees. So you'll get hot spots in your water in the microwave. So I just use a chopstick here to lightly stir that up to combine the different hot spots. And now I'm sitting at 79 degrees Fahrenheit on average, and I need to get that down to 77. So this is a common problem. You want to overshoot the target, which I did. Now I need to drop it down. So what I'm going to do is use some cold water out of my refrigerator filter to blend down some cold water to get this down to 2 degrees. So I'm sitting at 79 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm just adding some cold water to this. I stir it in with the tip of my thermometer. And now I'm at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 degrees Celsius, which is where I want to be. But now that I've added water, I'm over the quantity that I needed. I only need 175 grams, which is what I started with, and now I've gone over the quantity. So you just need to measure this back down to get back to your quantity when you add water to it to cool it down. That's the basic process I'm going to follow every time we do this calculation. Now it's time to mix the ingredients now that I have everything at the proper temperature, and let's see how this averages out. So I start with my bowl. I need 250 grams of flour because I'm making 1/4 of the standard recipe. I already combined 90% bread flour and 10% whole wheat flour in this bowl. So now I'm just going to measure out 250 grams of this. So we have 250 grams of flour. Now, I added the flour first. In the past, I used to add the water and the starter, and I would blend those two together. But let me show you an example of what happens when I did that, because it was really impacting my dough temperature. Now, one of the issues I had in the past was that I would calculate my water temperature, and then I would start to mix up the dough, and every time I mixed the dough would come up cooler than what the formula implied that it should have come out at. And what happens is, when I heat up my water to desired temperature, in this example I'm just going to show 85-degree water, which is 30 degrees Celsius. Every time I pour warm water into a bowl that's a different temperature, this is my room temperature, which is about 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius, the bowl is going to cool down the water as soon as the water hits the bowl. So you always have to think about this when you're doing anything with temperature. As you're touching another surface, that surface is impacting the temperature of the water. So I've just poured my 85-degree Fahrenheit water into that bowl, 30 degrees Celsius. I measure the temperature right now is 83 degrees, which is 28 degrees Celsius. I just lost 2 degrees Fahrenheit just by pouring that water into the bowl. So my 85-degree water turned into 83-degree water by putting it into the bowl. The other thing that happens is I would take my starter and dissolve the starter into the water. And the way that I would do that, I'd pour the starter in here and then I would mix it with a whisk for about 45 seconds. So I would pour my starter in, I would mix it for 45 seconds. I didn't put the starter in here, I'm just trying to show the impact of mixing the water with the whisk. 45 seconds later, my 83-degree water is now 81 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's 27.2 degrees Celsius. So I lost 2 more degrees Fahrenheit just by mixing with the whisk because I'm exposing that water to my room temperature air, which is lower than my water temperature. So you just have to be aware throughout the whole process. Every time you're touching the dough, you're potentially impacting the temperature of it because you're exposing it to room temperature, which is going to continually drop the temperature down, assuming that you're trying to achieve a temperature higher than room temperature. So in this example, where all these ingredients are really within a few degrees of each other, it wouldn't make that much of a difference whether they added the starter and the water first or the flour first. But just so I do this consistently across all the loaves, I'm going to start with the flour. I'm going to add in my 175 grams of water, which is at my desired temperature of 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 degrees Celsius. So I'm measuring this on my scale because I have more than 175 grams in here. There we are, 175. And now I need 50 grams of my leaven. I made a little bit more leaven than I needed. I tend to do that just so I have a little extra. 47, very close. 51, I'm going to go with that. Then I just use my spoon to kind of spread the leaven around in the mix. And then I want to mix this in really well to get that leaven fully distributed, because it goes in a big clump when you do it this way. It's not as effective as when you dissolve it in the water, but as I said, dissolving it in the water really changes the dough temperature. So for purposes of this exercise, I'm doing it this way, which isn't my preferred method, but it gives me a very accurate dough temperature when I do this. Okay, I mixed that for about a minute and a half. So all the ingredients are fully combined. Now let's see where our dough temperature ended up. 76 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're slightly over the target that we wanted to hit. Should have been 75. So I could have gone with that 76 degree water instead of 77 degree water. But as I said, I'd rather be over than under. I'm going to let this sit on the countertop now for 30 minutes. This is the fermentation process called for in the tartine recipe. This dough will approach my room temperature of 75, so I'm not worried about starting out 1 degree higher here. So I'm just going to cover this and leave it on the counter. We'll check back in 30 minutes. Okay, our 30-minute ferment release has completed at room temperature, which is 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Our dough was at 76 when we started this. It's still sitting at 76, so the dough will maintain its dough temperature even if it's slightly higher than room temperature, which is what this is doing. So we're 1 degree over, that's okay. Now it's time to add the salt. Now normally in the tartine recipe we would add the salt and then we would start the bulk fermentation process, which includes the stretching and folding method. Every 30 minutes we would do 5 rounds of that. I'm not going to do any stretch and folds with this dough because I want to evaluate the change in volume exactly without any impact of handling, because I really want to isolate the impact of time and temperature. And the handling always can impact the percent rise in the dough because you're degassing the dough every time you handle it. But by not doing the stretching and folding, we're not going to have an opportunity to build as much gluten in this dough as we would want to. So I'm actually going to add a short step here, and I'm going to do 2 to 3 minutes of something called slap and fold. This is a technique popularized by Richard Bertonet. He has some fantastic videos on this topic if you want to learn how to do it. And I'm going to do this right on my countertop as I add the salt. So I've pre-measured. I have 5 grams of salt, that's 1/4 of the recipe, 13 grams of water, 1/4 of the recipe. This should still be sitting at 75 degrees. It is, which is my room temperature and my desired dough temperature. The way that I add this, I just do it right on the countertop. I make a little indentation, spread the salt as evenly as possible, pour the water right on the dough like this, and then I just fold this in to this middle. If you're not adding very much water, you can do this right on the countertop like this. Now I want to combine that water into the dough, get that salt distributed. The dough kind of breaks apart at first. You get these big strands of dough. This is pretty typical. Then it will start to firm up again into a more cohesive ball. And now this is where I'm going to add a step. I'll start the timer so we have this just for the record. Now I'm going to do slap and fold for about 2 to 3 minutes. I'll see how it feels. After 2 minutes, it's about 2.5 minutes. I think that's good. It just helps develop some gluten because I'm not going to be touching this from this point forward. So now I'll move this into my bulk fermentation vessel. And for bulk fermentation, I'm using these chemistry beakers, which have perfectly straight sides on them, so the height equals the volume. And I have very fine milliliter markers on that side, so we can check the exact change in volume as we bulk ferment this dough. Okay, I have the dough in the bulk fermentation vessel, and I'm trying to level this as much as possible so I can really get an even starting point on all of this dough so we can really measure the change in volume. It should be right at about 375 milliliters when that settles down in there. So that's loaf number 1. I'm going to bulk ferment that now, and we're going to look for somewhere between a 20 to 30% rise in that dough. The tartine recipe calls for 20 to 30%. I'll monitor this every 30 minutes, and we'll start comparing this to the other loaves as well. And again, for the record, this one will bulk ferment at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius until it's done. It's time to mix up batch number 2. So this loaf will be our 82 degree Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius bulk fermented loaf. This is right on the high end of the range that's recommended in the tartine recipe, which calls for a bulk fermentation range between 78 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 25.5 to 28 degrees Celsius. So we'll be right on the high end of that range. This batch of leaven I actually mixed up today at room temperature. So this is my warmest batch of leaven and the shortest batch. This took about 5 hours to increase about 40% in height, in volume, and it's at about 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little bit warm. I had this on top of my refrigerator, 25.6 degrees Celsius up there. Let's do the float test and see if this is ready to go. It looks pretty good, and it is floating. Just like loaf number 1, this leaven looks and feels exactly the same to me. So this is good to go. Now let's take our temperatures of our known ingredients and calculate through our desired dough temperature what our target temperature of our water should be. So my leaven is sitting at 79 degrees Fahrenheit. My flour is at room temperature, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So if I take those two variables, I multiply my flour temperature times the flour grams, leaven temperature times 11 grams, and then I can calculate what the water temperature needs to be because I know that I need 175 grams of water. I punch that into my bread calculating supercomputer, and my results say that our calculated water temperature should be 93 degrees Fahrenheit. That's basing everything on equally weighted grams. 93 degrees Fahrenheit would bring all this up to 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. When I do the density weighted adjustment for the flour, because it's lower density than the water, it says that my water temperature only needs to be 89 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 32 degrees Celsius. And then if I do the standard desired dough temperature calculation using the 3-factor and the 4-factor method respectively, that would have given me a target water temperature of 96 degrees in the 3-factor method and 99 degrees in the 4-factor method, which feels really warm to me, and I believe it would overshoot the target. So I don't use that standard desired dough temperature calculation. The further you move away from room temperature with that calculation, the less reliable it is. So in this one, we have the two options of the gram weighted calculation or the density weighted calculation. I think I'm going to go with the density weighted calculation here to see how precise that really is. So this would tell me to use 89 degree Fahrenheit water, which is roughly 32 degrees Celsius. And that'll bring all the ingredients up to our target of 82 degrees. I'm going to give that a shot. Here are the details of the water temperature calculation in Fahrenheit and Celsius using all 4 of the methods. You can pause the video here if you're interested in looking at this in more detail. So I need to warm my water up to 89 degrees. It's currently sitting at 67. I have 175 milliliters. So I need to microwave this for about 15 seconds. And as I demonstrated with loaf number 1, you definitely want to stir up your water because you'll get some hot spots in here. 82 degrees, 89 degrees, just 2 different points in the water coming out of the microwave. Very different temperatures. The microwave does not heat evenly. So when I blend those together, I have an average temperature of 85 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm a little bit low. That's 29 degrees Celsius. I'm going to put this back in for a few more seconds. Okay, now I'm at 93 degrees Fahrenheit, so I overshot my target of 89. It's always okay to overshoot because you can always blend it down with a beaker of cool water. So I want to get this down to 89. I just pour a little bit in, blend it down. There we are, 89 degrees Fahrenheit, that's my target for the water. Now let's mix the ingredients together. Now, one thing that I'm doing with this batch is because Unlike the first batch where we were essentially mixing all of the ingredients at room temperature, now we're mixing the ingredients at a temperature that's higher than room temperature. So every time we're moving the ingredients around when they're touching these vessels, you touch the countertop, it wants to pull the temperature down to room temperature. So there's kind of a downward bias in all of these actions that we're doing that are going to pull the temperature down. So for example, when I use that glass mixing bowl that I like to mix in, that's been sitting at room temperature. As soon as the flour hits it, the water hits it, the starter hits it, it's going to pull those down to room temperature. So what I've done is I put that glass bowl in my sink and I filled it with hot tap water. So I've warmed that bowl up so that it won't immediately pull the temperature down. So let me get that bowl, dump out the water and dry it out, and then we'll move on from there. So I just warmed up this bowl by filling it with hot water, so that will keep the bowl from pulling down the temperature of my other ingredients. I need 250 grams of flour, which I've already pre-blended, bread flour and whole wheat flour, and pre-measured. 251, looking good. Next, I need 175 grams of my water at my target temperature of 89 degrees Fahrenheit, which is where it is. So I'm measuring as I'm pouring, because when I blended that cool water in, I went over my 175 target. So I'm watching my scale. $175 on the money. And then we need 50 grams of our leaven. Just double checking that temperature. That's still at 79 degrees, which is what we used in our calculation. $48. 50. Okay, now I will vigorously mix these ingredients and we'll see what our average temperature comes out to, looking for a target of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's more fully mixed the way that I mixed up loaf number 1. Take our temperature. Yeah, now we're down to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. So we lost 5 degrees of temperature off the water temperature just by mixing that together. That's really common, but I still have 3 degrees to go. I want to get this down to 82, so I don't want to waste that. So I'm actually going to do my slapping and folding now rather than when we add the salt, because I still have a few degrees to work with to get this down to 82. Now I don't want to go lower than 82 degrees, so I'm going to check this periodically because it's on this cold countertop. The countertop's 75 degrees. Every time it touches this dough, it's pulling the temperature down. Every time I turn the dough, I'm putting 75 degree Fahrenheit air into the dough. That's cooling it down. So even just after 20 seconds, we're at 82 degrees. So it dropped those 3 degrees incredibly quickly just by hitting that cold countertop. So we're at our target of 82. This goes into the proofing chamber, which right now is sitting at 84 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll open the door of the oven a little bit. I have my oven with the light on. Sits right in the low 80s. I'll get that exactly down to 82 degrees and we'll keep this in there for 30 minutes. Loaf number 2 has been in the proofing chamber for 30 minutes. Now it's time to add the salt. Let's take a quick temperature check. This is sitting at exactly 82, 83 degrees Fahrenheit. Slightly hotter than we wanted. It should be at 82. So I'm going to mix the salt in this bowl because I don't want this dough touching the countertop because that will start to reduce the temperature. I am adding 5 grams of salt and 13 grams of water. The water is at that 89 degrees, the same as my first batch of water. This small of an amount of water doesn't make a material impact on the temperature of the dough, but you don't want to reduce the temperature unnecessarily by adding cold water. I'm just going to fold this in. Still sitting at between 82 and 80, call it 83 degrees, so I didn't lose any temperature by doing that. So I'm going to keep hand mixing this dough just to try to build some gluten because we're not doing stretching and folding with these loaves. Okay, I did another minute of hand mixing and we are at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to go a little bit more on this. The dough is just kind of getting sticky now, so I'm not getting a lot more gluten development at this point. So we're at 82 degrees. I'm going to stop there, move this into the other proofing vessel. Okay, I just leveled that down. It's sitting at about 375 milliliters, the same as loaf number 1, which is what you would expect. These loaves should all be the same size. This goes into the proofing chamber, which is sitting at exactly 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius, and we'll watch this for the 30% target rise. So we are ready to mix up the dough for loaves 3 and 4. I'm going to mix these together, then I'll split them into 2 separate bulk fermentation vessels. Let's do our desired dough temperature calculation. So my flour has been sitting on the countertop. It's sitting at 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23.3 degrees Celsius. My starter was on top of my refrigerator, so it's a little warmer. This is 78 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have 74 degree flour, 78 degree starter. We want to get to 90 degree dough. So if we do our desired dough temperature calculation, that'll tell us what our water should be. I have 350 grams of water here for the 75% hydration. Let me punch these numbers into my super bread computer. And here are the results. So our desired dough temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. So if I do the gram weighted calculation, we take 74 degree flour times 500 grams. I take 78 degree starter times 100 grams, and I back into my water temperature that I need at 350 grams of water. Now that using the gram weighted version, that means I need 116 degree water, which is pretty warm. If I do the density adjusted version of that, where I account for the lower density of the flour and the starter, that gives me a target temperature of 106 degrees Fahrenheit, so 10 degrees cooler on the water. And then if I do the standard desired dough temperature calculation using the 3-factor method, I get a very warm 121 degree water temperature. And the 4-factor method gives me 133 degree Fahrenheit water temperature, which would start to kill off the yeast. That's why the desired dough temperature calculator really does not work when you start to move away from room temperature and you start to get up to these higher bulk fermentation temperatures. It's part of the reason that I do not use that. So I have 2 options here in my gram weighted and density adjusted versions between 116 degrees Fahrenheit and 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as I think about this, I need this dough to end up at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But if I do that slap and fold method on the countertop, I'm going to be exposing this dough to room temperature air, which is going to want to cool it down. So between these 2 options that I have, 116 and 106, I'm going to pick something in the middle. I'm going to go with about 110 degree Fahrenheit water, and that should give me a dough temperature of about 92 or 93 degrees after I mix the ingredients. When I do the slap and fold, it's going to reduce that temperature down to 90 as I expose it to air. At least that's the theory. Here are the details of the water temperature calculation in Fahrenheit and Celsius using all 4 of the methods. You can pause the video here if you're interested in looking at this in more detail. So let's see how it goes. So I need to get this water up to 110 degrees. It's sitting at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I look at my water temperature calculation chart, and I need to get this into the microwave for about a minute. While that's heating up in the microwave, I'm going to measure out my 500 grams of flour from my blend. Okay, now we're at 115, so I blend this down with some cool water. $110. That's right where we want to be. Now I need to add 350 grams of this to my flour mixture. $351. And lastly, I need 100 grams of leaven. So this leaven got off to a slow start like the other one. I started this in the middle of the night. It has risen about 45% in height, very similar to the other one. This one has been going for about 8 hours. So a little bit shorter time than the first batch because this only had 3 hours at that low 60-degree Fahrenheit temperature. It was 63 degrees in my kitchen overnight, 17.2 degrees Celsius. And then this had about 5 hours at a warmer room temperature between 75 and 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which was roughly 25 degrees Celsius. So that's why this leaven finished up more quickly than the first batch. Again, it's the combination of time and temperature, and the yeast doesn't know what time it is. The yeast only knows the temperature. So I'm going by that percent rise to say that this batch is equivalent to the first batch because they both rose roughly 40 to 50% in height. Let's do the float test on this one. Now, this leaven looks slightly more aerated than my first batch that we did the initial float test on. That's floating, just like the other ones. So this is good to go. I think all this leaven came out really consistent across 3 batches, even though I started them at different times. So I add 100 grams of leaven. Now I need to mix this in vigorously. Okay, those ingredients are basically combined into a shaggy ball. Let me take the temperature and see how close we came out with our dough temperature calculation with that 110 degree Fahrenheit water. I think it's going to overshoot the 90 degree target slightly. We're at 91, 92 degrees Fahrenheit, 33.3 degrees Celsius. That's a really good blend. Now, with this one, I could let this sit for 30 minutes, then add the salt and do the slap and fold. But by that time, my temperature will probably come down to 90 degrees. And when I do the slap and fold, it's going to drop below 90 degrees. So I'm going to change the sequence here and do the slap and fold now because I have 2 degrees of temperature to work with, rather than just let that temperature dissipate in the proofing chamber. I'm going to use that temperature because as I slap and fold this, as soon as I hit the countertop, it's going to reduce the temperature of this dough. And very quickly, probably within a minute, I'm going to lose a couple degrees of temperature with the slap and fold. But I'd rather do it now while I'm slightly over my target, as opposed to trying to pull the dough temperature up later. Let me set my timer, and I'm going to take the temperature every 30 seconds to see how much temperature we're losing by doing this. Okay, 30 seconds of slapping and folding. Dropped my temperature 4 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm already down to 88 degrees. So now I'm below my target. I don't want to be there, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to get this into my proofing chamber, try to get this back up to the target of 90, which is where we want to be for the whole process. So we're just 2 degrees under right now. I'm not getting much gluten development on this loaf because it's dropping my temperature too much. I'll see if we can get a little bit more when we add the salt. So this goes into my proofing chamber. For my proofing chamber, I have the oven with the light on, which only gets my temperature up to about 85 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 30 degrees Celsius. It needs to be at 90. So I put a liter of boiling water into my oven about a half hour ago. That brought the temperature up above 90 degrees. Right now it's sitting at about 94 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 34.4 degrees Celsius. It's a little warm. So I'm going to crack the door open, try to get it right back down to 90. Put this dough in and see if we can get this back up to 90 degrees exactly. As I mentioned earlier in the video, when our dough, or particularly our starter, gets above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, we really start to risk that we'll release the protease enzyme into the dough, which will start to break down the gluten structure. So we want to be really careful. Like right now, my proofing chamber is at 94 degrees Fahrenheit. 34 degrees Celsius. This is risky putting this in there, so I'm going to try to get it down to 90 real quickly. It's time to add the salt. Now, when I did the prior loaves, I took the dough out and put it on the countertop, which really lowered the temperature as soon as the dough hits the countertop. Let's see where we are with our temperature. We went into the proofing chamber at 88 degrees Fahrenheit, a few degrees below where we wanted to be. Our target was 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. We're sitting at 89 degrees Fahrenheit right now. So 1 degree off of where we want to be, but I don't want to lose any more dough temperature through this mixing process. So I'm going to leave the dough in this bowl because the bowl is warm, the countertop is cold, and I'm just going to mix it in the bowl. We have the opportunity to add a little bit more warmth here. 25 grams of water doesn't have a material impact on a dough of this size, but I am doing this at the same 110 degrees Fahrenheit that I did the original batch of water. And our salt, which is at room temperature, really can't do anything about that. So I'm adding 10 grams of salt, 25 grams of water. And I'm going to mix this pretty vigorously because I want to combine the ingredients, obviously, but also do a little bit of more aggressive stretching as I'm mixing the dough to try to get a little last attempt at some gluten development here. Okay, that's about 1 minute of mixing. Let's see what that did to our temperature. We're at 88 degrees Fahrenheit, so we only lost 1 degree through this mixing. I'm going to keep going. Check it out. Okay, that's about another minute. This dough feels kind of stringy. It's almost feeling like it wants to overproof already. So I don't want to handle this anymore. We're at 87 degrees Fahrenheit. That's as far as I'm going to go. So I'm going to put this into 2 separate bulk fermentation vessels. We'll mark those at the current height, put these into the 90-degree proofing chamber, and watch these very closely over the next couple hours. Now, while we're waiting for the loaves to bulk ferment, let's recap what I did with the leaven and how I created 3 different batches of leaven using different times and temperature. Now, in some ways, this happened by accident because my kitchen temperature was so cool last night. As I mentioned, we're kind of in the seasonal transition here in October, and we had a very cool night. So I started 2 of the batches of leaven late in the evening last night, but my room temperature in my kitchen was in the low 60s Fahrenheit, about 17 degrees Celsius, and the leaven really didn't do anything until I woke up in the morning and saw that they were basically sitting dormant, and they started to warm up after that. So as a recap, for loaf number 1, that leaven took 11 hours to complete, It went for about 7 hours at 63 degrees Fahrenheit or 17 degrees Celsius, and 4 hours at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and that rose about 50% in that time. Loaf number 2, this was the one that I made today at room temperature. This was the fastest one. That took 5 hours from start to finish at an average temperature of about 78 degrees, sitting on top of my refrigerator, which is the warmest spot in my kitchen. And that rose about 40% in that 5 hours of time. And then loaves number 3 and 4, that leaven took 8 hours. Part of it started in the middle of the night last night, so it had 3 hours at the very low temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit and 5 hours at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and that rose about 45%. As I'm going back and looking at all 3 of these, there's some real similarity here that almost all of them took 5 hours, with the exception of loaf number 1, took 4 hours at that 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So at that very cool temperature during the night, the leaven really didn't do anything until it warmed up, and each one of these took, roughly between 4 and 5 hours at 77 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the leaven rose between 40 and 50%. It all looked incredibly consistent. If I had to go back and watch the videotape and try to identify just from looking at the leaven which one was loaf 1, loaf 2, loaf 3, and 4, I couldn't do it just by looking at it, because they all came out looking exactly the same. They all passed the float test the same way. So this is an interesting comparison that we had, leaven going from an 11-hour leaven build to a 5-hour leaven build, and they all came out exactly the same. So all of the batches of dough are now mixed, and they are in their respective bulk fermentation areas. Loaf number 1 is bulk fermenting at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius on my countertop. That's exactly what my room temperature is. Loaf number 2 is bulk fermenting in one of my ovens at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius with the light bulb turned on. And loaves 3 and 4 are in the other oven with the light turned on and a liter of boiling water in that oven to keep that temperature at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius. What I will be doing now is tracking the percentage rise in the dough in the 4 loaves every 30 minutes. So what we want to look for is the difference in the fermentation curve, if you will, at these different temperatures. This will be very insightful to determine what's the different ratio of fermentation relative to these changes in temperature. Now, the 3 temperatures that I chose, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and respectively in Celsius, 24 degrees, 28 degrees, and 32 degrees, is because that total distance between the coolest loaf and the warmest loaf is 15 degrees Fahrenheit or 8 degrees Celsius. This is what is theoretically thrown around as a rule of thumb that says the fermentation rate doubles when you have a 15-degree change in Fahrenheit in the dough temperature or an 8-degree change in Celsius in the dough temperature. So theoretically, if that rule of thumb works, loaf number 3 and 4, for example, at the warmest temperature, let's say those bulk ferment in 3 hours, loaf number 1 at 15 degrees cooler temperature should bulk ferment in 6 hours. It should take double the amount of time between those 2 extreme ends. That's one of the things that we want to be able to prove or disprove, is if that rule of thumb works. The other thing that we're trying to do is to manage bulk fermentation so all of these 4 loaves end at exactly the same percent rise, so that we can then move these into proofing baskets, shaping baskets. I'm not going to do any shaping, no pre-shaping and no final shaping. I just want to take the bulk fermented dough, put it into a shaping basket, and then we'll do final proof in the refrigerator for loaves 1, 2, and 3, final proof on the countertop for loaf number 4, and then when I bake all of these up, if this actually works properly, when we cut the loaves open, all 4 of these loaves should look exactly the same. Because what we're trying to prove is that by managing bulk fermentation and final proofing time, you can compensate for differences in bulk fermentation temperature.